to talk about threading text frames together. Let me go to the next spread by going to the Layout menu and choosing Next Spread. I'm going to select this text frame with the selection tool and go into 100% view, which is Command 1 on the Mac or Control 1 on Windows. The story in this text frame ends abruptly, and if we look in the lower right corner, we'll see a little plus sign. That means this text is overset. That is, there's more text in the story that can fit into the one frame. We could make the frame bigger, but in this case we want the text to flow from this page to a text frame up on another page. To thread these frames, I have to pay attention to the import and the output. The import of a text frame is this little square in the upper left corner, and the output is a square in the lower right corner. This output has a plus in it, which means that there's more text to come, and if I click on that output with the selection tool or the direct selection tool, it loads the place cursor just as though I were placing a story. Now I can move over to where I want to place it. All my navigation features still function, so I can use the scroll bars, or in this case I'll use the Option spacebar or Alt spacebar on Windows shortcut for dragging my page over. I just Option spacebar, click and drag. Then I come over to this page, and there's a frame sitting there, and when I hover the cursor over this frame, you'll see a little chain icon. That means when I click here, it's going to thread from that frame to this frame, which is exactly what I want. I'll click, and in comes the text. Now let's see how to unthread this. To unthread these frames so that the text goes back into the first frame, simply click on the output or the import. In this case, I'll choose the import of this frame, and notice how the cursor changes. Now this says it's going to create a new frame and put more text into it. That's not what I want. So I'm going to hover over the frame itself. You see that cursor changes yet again to an icon which is supposed to look like a chain breaking. To me it looks like handcuffs, so it doesn't work for me. But I get the idea. If I click on there, it will unthread that frame and it all goes back into here again. Let's go ahead and rethread those again. I'll scroll down a little bit until I see the cursor, click on it, and then click over here, and it threads it together. What if you're given a document and you can't tell exactly what's threaded to what? Well, InDesign can show you which frames are threaded together if you go to the View menu and choose Show Text Threads. This red line tells me that the text flows out of this frame and into this frame, but if I deselect by clicking in this area over here where there's no objects, the red line disappears. It only shows up when one frame in that story has been selected. I should point out that you can thread together any text frames, even frames that have stuff in them. For example, I can thread this frame to this frame, even though this frame still has some text in it. The text gets merged into a single story that threads from this frame to this frame. Of course, in this case, all the text will fit into the first frame, so none spills over into the second. In the next movie, we step away from getting text into frames and start to focus on the frames themselves and talk about some of the things you can do to format those frames. If you've ever framed some kind of artwork to hang on your wall, you know that there's all kinds of ways to present something inside of a frame. Well, the same thing is true for text inside of a text frame. The key is the Text Frame Options dialog box. Here, let me show you what I mean. First, I'm going to jump to the second spread of the magazine layout by going to the Layout menu and choosing Next Spread. I want to work on this text frame, so I'll select it with the selection tool, and I'll press Command 1 on the Mac or Control 1 on Windows to jump to 100%. What I see is a single column frame, but I'm going to change that in a minute by going to the Object menu and choosing Text Frame Options. I'll move the dialog box out of the way a little bit so we can see our text frame a little bit better. Now the Text Frame Options dialog box lets me specify all sorts of properties about my frame itself. For example, the number of columns. If I change this to 2, it suddenly changes to a 2-column frame. If yours doesn't update immediately on screen, try turning on the Preview checkbox in the lower left corner of the dialog box. The space between the columns is called the gutter, and it's not quite large enough to match the rest of my layout, so I'm going to change the gutter setting to 1 pica 9. As soon as I click in any other field in here, it automatically updates, again because the Preview checkbox is turned on. Now I have a 2-column frame that's looking pretty good. The Inset Spacing feature inside the Text Frame Options dialog box lets me control how far in from the side of the frame I want my text to begin. So for example, if I wanted to inset the text on all 4 sides, I would make sure that the little link icon is turned on, and then change the amount that I wanted to inset from here. I'll change this to, let's say, 0.25 inches. As soon as I click on any other field, it insets on the page. The preview checkbox is great because you can try things out and experiment, see how things work. In this case, I'm finding that that inset is not working for me, so I'm going to set it back to 0. I hit the Tab key to automatically jump to the next field and have it update. To talk about vertical justification, first I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to thread this frame into the next frame, just like I did in the last movie. Click in the output, click up on this frame, and then I'm going to scroll over a little bit using the Option spacebar or Alt spacebar keyboard shortcuts. Click and drag, moves over here, and I can see that the text flows in here, but it doesn't flow all the way to the bottom of the frame. In order to change the behavior of this frame so that the text always goes from the top to the bottom of the frame, I'm going to go back to the Object menu and choose Text Frame Options, and I'm going to adjust the vertical justification of this frame. Right now, the vertical justification is set to top. That means that the text will always start at the top of the frame and go down until it ends. But I could just as easily change this to bottom, so that the bottom of the text ends up at the bottom of the frame and sort of pushes itself up until it ends. But in this case, I want the best of both worlds. I'm going to use justify, and justify means start the text at the top of the frame and add space throughout until it ends at the bottom of the frame. It makes sure that the text always reaches the entire height of the frame. The problem is that in order for InDesign to do this, it has to add space between every single line, which makes this text look very different than this text over here. So they've added this thing called paragraph spacing limit. That's a mouthful, but here's what it really means. I'm going to change this to, let's say, 20 millimeters. Just pick whatever measurement you want, and this tells InDesign that it's okay to add up to 20 millimeters between each paragraph so that it doesn't have to add space in between each line. When I click over here in a different field, it updates and I can see that InDesign added the space between every paragraph, did not change the spacing between the lines of the text within the paragraph, and that makes it a little bit more consistent with the other text in the story. There are several other features inside the Text Frame Options dialog box, including Ignore Text Wrap and Baseline Options, but those are a little bit more complex, so I'm going to cover those in later chapters. I get asked this question all the time. How do I put text on a path instead of inside a frame? You need to use the Text on a Path tool. For example, let me make a new frame. I'm going to use the ellipsed frame tool here, just drag out kind of a curvy shape here, and I want to put this dragon well text along this path. Here's how I would do it. First I grab the Type tool, and I'm going to click inside the dragon well text frame, and I'll select it. Do a Command A or Control A on Windows to select all of it, and then I'll do a Command X or Control X to cut it. It's as simple as that. Next, I need to switch tools. I can't use the Type tool to click on this frame because that will put the text into the frame. Instead, I need to go look for the Hidden tool. Click and hold until I see the Type on a Path tool. There it is. Choose that tool, and then click on the edge of the path that I want to put the text on. In this case, the path that I'm going to put my text along is a frame, but it could be an open line, like a Bezier line that I drew with a Bezier pen tool. It's up to you. Now I'm simply going to do a Command V or a Control V on Windows to paste that text along this path. There it is, looks pretty good, but it's not centered. Why not? Well, let me go select that path with the Selection tool and we'll see. When I choose my path with the Selection tool, I see all kinds of other things show up, including these big vertical lines. That's actually two different vertical lines right next to each other, and two boxes right next to each other. What's going on there? Well, you have to understand that when I put text on a path, it's as though I took a big rectangular frame, like any normal text frame, and wrapped it all the way around the path. And so this is actually the left edge of the frame, and this is the right edge of the frame, and they're both pretty much in the same place. This square is the in port, just as though it were a regular text frame, and that's the out port. Yes, you can actually thread text into a text on a path, and then right out of the text on a path again. It's up to you. So if I want to adjust the position of this text on the path, I'd place the cursor on top of one of those lines. Now you have to be very careful to look at the cursor. Right here I see a tiny black line with a right arrow. That means that I'm adjusting the left side of the path. This is very confusing, but if I move the cursor over just a few pixels here so that I see a line with an arrow pointing to the left, that means I'm going to be adjusting the right side of the frame, the other side. So let me go move back over here until I see an arrow pointing to the right, then I'm going to click and drag that over, and when I do that, you can see that it separates. Now my text will never flow into this area. It only flows between here, around, until here. That's what's going on there. So I can now adjust this one as much as I want to until I get just the effect I'm looking for. When you're trying to adjust your text along the path, make sure you don't click on those white boxes, the import or the output. That'll just mess you up. Just move the vertical lines. This is looking pretty good, but I want to make a few more adjustments. So I'm going to go to the Type menu and go to Type on a Path and choose Options. The Type on a Path Options dialog box lets me control several properties about my text on a path. For example, I might want to change the Align pop-up menu from baseline to center. That changes the text so that the center of the text goes along the path. In this case, because it's all lowercase, the center of the path looks a little bit wrong. I can also change the effect from rainbow to skew, or let me try stair step. And stair step will actually place the text along the path. Each letter goes along the path, but it does not rotate or skew the text at all. It's a different effect. It's up to you. The spacing feature lets me change how much space is in between each character. The weird thing is, when you use negative spacing, it actually makes the characters farther away. I've never understood why Adobe does it this way, but that's the way it works. Negative numbers make them farther away, and positive numbers make them closer together. Finally, the flip checkbox flips the text over to the other side of the path. In this case, it looks really wrong. We better change this back to rainbow to see what's going on. It's starting on the left edge of the frame, and it's moving around. We can't see this because this is white on top of white, and then it ends up over here. It just flips it around to the other side. Obviously, you can use this to create all kinds of weird special effects on your page, and you can even edit this text. If I click OK, go back to my Type tool, I can just edit this just by dragging on top of it, and then edit it to some other text. But you know, editing text along the path can be, well, challenging at best, especially when there's a lot of text. Fortunately, InDesign's Story Editor comes to the rescue, and that's the feature I'm going to talk about in the next movie.